Have you ever been tested not for your skills, but for your worth as a human being? Amira Johnson had a 26-year-old black woman with eyes well trained to stare down doors that had been slammed in her face. All she needed was $42,000, just enough to save her mother's corner store, the little place that had kept her family afloat for 3 generations. But that morning, when she walked into a white mansion on the hills of Charleston, what she found wasn't a job. It was an open door. Inside, $5 million in cash, blinding jewelry, and stacks of sensitive files, all laid out, no locks, no covers, as if someone wanted to tempt her, and someone did. Elias Monroe, a 78-year-old millionaire, bitter, ruthless, and long past believing in people, was sitting somewhere in that house, watching her every move through a network of 16 cameras. In his mind, only one thought circled: let's see how long she lasts before she touches the money. To Elias, everyone had a price, and the poor were the easiest to predict. But Amira hadn't come here to take. She'd come here to hold on to the fragile decency the world kept trying to crush, to hold on to a small, stubborn belief that not everything laid in front of you is meant to be grabbed. Elias thought he was testing her. He didn't know she would become the one to test the last shred of humanity left in him, and the game he started would turn both their lives upside down. Before we go on, if you've ever been judged before you had the chance to prove who you really are, hit like, share this story so others can hear it, and don't forget to subscribe. We have more stories of resilience and quiet strength to tell. And now, the story begins. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, bouncing off the cold marble floors of the Monroe estate. Amira stood in the long hallway, staring at a half-open door. Behind it, a fortune. And upstairs, an old man watching her through 16 cameras, waiting for the moment he believed would reveal her true nature. She needed $42,000 to save her family's store. He left $5 million sitting behind an open door, and he was certain she would fail. After all, people like her, don't they always? Elias Monroe sat in his silent study, a man who had long since stopped believing in decency. At 78, he still had enough money to fill rooms, buy handshakes, and keep his name etched onto prestigious plaques, but none of it softened the calluses in his heart, left there by betrayal. Once, Elias had believed in the value of a handshake, in the loyalty of the men who called him brother, in the gratitude of his own children who'd inherit his legacy. But in the end, they were the ones who tore him apart for their own gain. His eldest son plotted to take over the company before the ink on his retirement papers had even dried. His daughter drained the account he'd set aside for her education. Friends turned opportunists. The world had shown Elias its true face, and he had learned his lesson. People are liars in pressed suits, predators who smile while hollowing you out. The Monroe estate mirrored its owner, grand, elegant, but built to watch, not to live in. 24 rooms, 16 cameras, walls lined with paintings no one stopped to admire. It was kept spotless to the point of sterility, not for enjoyment, but for control. There was no laughter here, only the hum of machines and the creak of aging wood. This wasn't a home. This was a fortress for a man at war with his own memories. Margaret Shaw, his secretary of nearly 3 decades, lingered in the doorway, her hands clasped, her chin lifted in that familiar posture of veiled reproach. "Sir," she said, her voice sweet as the pearls around her neck, "do you really trust her? You know what they're like." Elias didn't lift his eyes from the notebook on his lap, but her words hung in the air like a crack in an old wall. He'd heard that tone before, the kind that dripped venom beneath civility, that made the word her sound like something less than human. It wasn't the first time Margaret had let her carefully dressed contempt slip through. Elias gave a low hum, neither agreeing nor denying. Truthfully, he didn't trust the new girl any more than he trusted Margaret. Amira Johnson, 26, black, soft-spoken. A graduate student cleaning houses to pay tuition, was a stranger in his world. He'd read her file, skimmed through her references, but paperwork didn't make a person. People could lie as easily on paper as they did to your face. So Elias did what he did best. He'd test her, not with words, not with an interview, but with temptation. An unlocked door, a room full of cash and valuables, $5 million as bait for a young woman who, if Margaret was right, wouldn't last long. "Let's see," Elias muttered, lips curling into a half-smile, equal parts amusement and disdain. "Let's see what she does when she thinks no one's watching." Elias Monroe never did anything without a plan. When he decided to test Amira Johnson, it became a ritual, a game whose rules only he knew. That morning, he personally unlocked the heavy wooden door at the end of the first-floor hall. Outsiders called it the storage room, but Elias still used its real name in his mind, the vault. It wasn't just for money. It was a tomb for his life's work, piles of documents, copies of contracts, old stock certificates, yellowed letters, and pieces of jewelry that had belonged to his late wife, Miriam, the only woman he'd ever truly trusted. Elias staged the room like a set. Stacks of $100 bills, bundled and tucked into 4 black leather cases, neatly arranged on the long table in the center. No locks, no covers. Beside them, a silver tray of fine jewelry, pearl necklaces, a white gold brooch that had once belonged to Miriam. Important documents, deeds, stock papers, old passports were deliberately left ajar, as if someone had rifled through them but hadn't yet cleaned up. Everything in plain sight, easy enough to take that it became almost impossible to resist. Elias knew for someone as desperate as Amira, even one of those stacks could change her life. He stepped back, inspecting the room in the pale morning light streaming through the tall windows. At 78, he still felt the thrill of a predator waiting for its prey. He left the door slightly ajar, just enough for anyone walking by to see inside. He disabled the alarm system, leaving everything natural, as if by careless accident, a calculated carelessness. Then he retreated to his study upstairs, where he could watch the entire hallway through his wall of monitors. Adjusting his armchair toward the screens, Elias rested his elbows on the armrests and took a sip of cold, bitter coffee. His eyes locked on the camera feed showing the hallway where Amira would pass. "What will you do?" he murmured, "when you think no one sees you?" He thought about all the others. The gardener last year who pocketed loose change from a drawer, the cook 2 summers ago who slipped a silver spoon into her purse. Elias had fired them all. No explanations needed. To him, people were predictable. Everyone was greedy, and, given the right circumstances, their true selves would always surface. He leaned back, the deep lines around his eyes unmoving. In his head, the mantra repeated like gospel, "Everyone's greedy. It's only a matter of time before you see their real face." Morning light cut through the tall windows, casting cold streaks across the marble floors, on the monitors. The Monroe hallway looked like a still painting, towering white walls, moss-green carpet, and at the far end, the half-open door to the room of secrets. No sound, just the soft hum of the cameras and Elias's heart pounding in his chest. He sat motionless, fingers gripping the chair arms, eyes fixed on the screen. He hadn't felt this kind of anticipation in years. It wasn't about the money. $5 million meant nothing to him. It was about this moment, the one he believed would reveal the truth. Everyone has a price. Everyone bows to temptation when they think no one's looking. The wall clock ticked, stretching the silence like a wire pulled taut. He could already picture it, Amira stepping inside, eyes widening, hands trembling as they brushed over the stacks of cash. Maybe she'd only take one bundle, tucking it into her coat. Maybe something smaller, a bracelet, a slip of paper, hoping he wouldn't notice. They were all the same. From the people he'd once loved to the strangers who passed through his life, they'd all proven it. Movement flickered on the screen. Amira appeared in the corner of the frame. Her walk was calm, her worn shoes barely making a sound on the carpet. She didn't rush. She didn't glance around like someone with something to hide. Elias leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she approached the open door. She stopped. She didn't step inside. She didn't touch anything. Amira simply stood there, staring into the room for a long moment, her face unreadable. Elias frowned. He wasn't used to people who didn't follow his script. "Let's see who you are," he muttered, his voice rasping in the still room. "On the screen." Amira tilted her head slightly, as if weighing something. Then she slowly pulled out her phone. Elias tensed, watching every move. Not to take a picture, not to send a text, but to make a call. When she finished, she didn't leave. She moved a nearby chair, set it in front of the door, and sat down. The girl didn't take anything. She didn't enter. She just sat there, like a sentry no one had hired. Elias leaned back, a thin smile flickering on his lips, though his eyes darkened. The game was no longer predictable. And what sat in front of him now wasn't a petty thief. It was a question he couldn't yet answer. Amira Johnson appeared at the far end of the hallway, her slender frame seeming to vanish between the towering white walls and tall glass windows. She wore a pale beige button-up with rolled sleeves, faded jeans, and shoes so worn the toes were fraying. Her hair was tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her face bare of makeup. No designer bag, no latest model phone, just a small canvas backpack that Elias assumed held a few basic cleaning supplies. She walked slowly, one hand brushing the wall for balance, her gaze passing over the paintings lining the hallway without lingering. There was no curiosity, no deliberate effort to admire or investigate, only the quiet steps of someone used to being an outsider, someone who knew she wasn't meant to belong here. Elias watched her on the monitor, the corner of his mouth curling into a half-smile, half-mocking, half-calculating. No makeup, no pretense, but that's easy to fake, he muttered under his breath. He'd met plenty of people who crafted a humble appearance, a plain mask designed to inspire trust, and those were often the quickest hands when temptation came calling. What's so different about her, he thought? 26 years old, working 2 jobs while carrying the debt of graduate school, supporting a family that clung to her meager wages. Elias didn't need her financial report to know it. Desperation is the cheapest thing to buy. And nothing sells a person faster than cash, especially when it's sitting wide open, piled high enough to look endless. He remembered the others, the gardener who couldn't resist a few bills in a drawer, the cook who lost her job over a silver spoon. Elias had fired them on the spot. No explanations needed. He trusted actions, not words. And actions, no matter how carefully disguised, always revealed the truth. On the monitor, Amira kept walking. Her worn shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. As she neared the open door, she stopped. Elias leaned forward, holding his breath like a predator waiting for its prey to step into the trap. He'd already answered the question for himself. It's only a matter of time. It always is. "Let's see how long you can keep up the act," Elias murmured, his eyes locked on the young woman standing at the threshold of his test. Amira froze as soon as she saw the door. It was ajar just enough for the morning light from the window to spill inside, glinting off what lay within. She didn't need to take another step to know this wasn't an ordinary room. The air felt different here, colder, stricter, like a world sealed off from the rest of the house. On the surveillance feed. Elias leaned in. He could almost hear his own heartbeat. This was the moment he'd been waiting for, the moment when a person's true nature surfaced. Like a hunter in stillness, he watched, ready for the lunge of someone cornered by temptation. Amira stood still at the threshold, her eyes fixed on the room where stacks of cash and a silver tray of jewelry gleamed. The tension stretched tight, humming like a wire. Anyone who crossed that line would feel it snap, a signal that nothing would be the same afterward. But she didn't step inside. Instead, Amira took a step back. The movement was firm, without hesitation. Then she turned, walked to the side wall, dragged over a small wooden chair, and set it directly in front of the door. Her movements were calm, deliberate, not the jerky flinch of someone overwhelmed by temptation, nor the tense stiffness of someone terrified. Elias narrowed his eyes. He wasn't used to this script. None of the others had done this. They'd all been drawn in, or at least feigned disinterest before sneaking a glance inside. But this girl, it was as if she was doing the most natural thing in the world. Amira placed the chair down. The dry scrape of its legs against the wood cut through the heavy silence of the hallway. She slipped off her backpack, set it neatly at her feet, then sat down back straight, hands folded in her lap. Her gaze stayed fixed on the room, not with hunger, not with fear, simply watchful, alert, as if she just assigned herself a job no one asked her to do: sit here and guard. Upstairs, Elias sank back into his chair. His lips twitched. He couldn't tell if it was a smirk or something closer to unease. He'd seen plenty of reactions to temptation: greed, fear, hesitation, but never this. No rush, no performance, just a quiet, unsettling stillness. What is this? He wondered. Another layer of pretense. Or is she really different from the rest? In the muted light, Amira looked like a sentry, unpaid, unasked for, and in that, she'd turned the trap Elias had set into something else entirely, a question he couldn't yet answer. Elias leaned closer to the screen, eyes locked on her posture. He felt as if someone had just scrambled the game board he'd spent years mastering. For decades, he'd prided himself on knowing exactly how people reacted to temptation. They all followed the same pattern: a moment of hesitation, a little self-reassurance, then the hand reaching out for what they secretly wanted. Every gesture, every glance, perfectly predictable. But this girl, no. He sipped his cold, bitter coffee, letting the taste bite his tongue, and muttered, "What game are you playing? Why does this look nothing like before?" The words, hoarse and low, filled the stillness of his study, half a question for her, half for himself. Amira didn't move. No fidgeting. No distracting herself. She didn't step inside the room, and she didn't walk away. She just sat there, facing it, eyes fixed on the shadowed doorway as though guarding something valuable, though no one had given her that duty. Her poise, her silence, it unnerved him. He'd had the whole scene mapped out: a few minutes of wavering, a little self-talk, then a hand reaching for the prize. After that, he'd have his proof, reason enough to fire her, reason enough to keep believing what he already knew, that no one was truly good. But now this girl was breaking all of it. Elias felt a strange new thing creeping in: curiosity tangled with irritation. Why was she just sitting there, if she wanted to seem honest? Why not leave, if she wanted to protect? Why not call someone? Her actions didn't match any of the reactions he'd come to expect, and that made him impatient. The monitor captured every detail: the way Amira occasionally straightened her spine, how her fingers stayed interlaced in her lap as if she were holding herself together, her eyes locked on the room as though she feared something inside might escape. The longer Elias watched, the more it chipped away at the stubborn walls of his convictions. His study suddenly felt too small. He set his mug down with a quiet thud, the sound echoing like a warning. This was supposed to be a morning of confirmation, a routine test to justify his beliefs. But now, he felt like the one under observation, stripped bare by the silence of the girl on his screen. He leaned forward, whispering as if issuing a challenge to the monitor. "Let's see who you really are." At the end of the hallway, the young woman sat calmly, as if time itself had stopped. And for Elias, the game was no longer simple. The phone rang softly in the wide hallway, its chime echoing like a confession lost in the cold air. Amira raised it to her ear, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was low but clear enough for the ceiling-mounted security mic to catch every word. "Mama, they're going to shut it down. We need 42,000, or we'll lose everything." The sentence ended there, trailing into a heavy silence. Elias listened through the audio feed wired into his study, each word hitting him as if it weren't just a phone call, but an open door into a story he'd never cared to know. "I'm trying. Mama." Amira's voice trembled. "I don't know how, but I'll figure it out." There was a sigh on the other end, followed by words too faint for Elias to make out. Amira nodded slightly, as if her mother could see her, then closed her eyes, inhaling deeply to steady the surge of emotion climbing her throat. She said goodbye, lowered the phone, and quietly held it in her palms as though it might shatter if she let go. Elias sat frozen, his chin resting on his clasped hand. He'd heard plenty of pleading in his lifetime, people begging for jobs, for loans, for second chances, but this unsettled him in a way he couldn't name. This wasn't a performance for his benefit. Amira didn't know he was listening, didn't know he was watching. It was raw life, unfiltered, untouched by artifice. On the monitor, Amira still sat on the chair by the open door, not leaving, not collapsing. She simply leaned forward slightly, her hands clenched together in her lap, holding herself together in the only way she could. Elias noticed the restraint in each small movement and, unbidden, thought of Miriam. Miriam, his late wife, who could hold her composure even as the world crumbled around her. He pushed the memory away, but the image of Amira remained. Heavy in his mind, a young woman carrying the weight of an entire family in her eyes, sitting watch over a doorway filled with enough money to erase her troubles with a single step. Just one step. Just one reach of the hand. But she didn't. Elias leaned back, drawing in a deep breath. He'd built his life on the belief that people were predictable, that hardship bent principles until they snapped. But the scene before him didn't fit into his neat conclusions. It shattered them. He leaned forward, zooming in on the feed as if proximity might help him understand. And for the first time in years, Elias wasn't watching to judge. He was watching to listen. Amira reached into the small canvas backpack at her feet and pulled out a carefully folded foil packet. Inside was a plain sandwich, dry bread, and slices of ham that had darkened from sitting too long. She didn't eat quickly, nor did she take her eyes off the slightly open door. Instead, she broke the sandwich in half, set one piece beside the chair as if saving it, then took slow, small bites of the other. Each movement was calm, deliberate, a quiet ritual to keep herself steady, to anchor herself after the storm that phone call had stirred. Elias stared at the monitor. He didn't understand this girl. Who sits guard over a room full of millions and eats a stale sandwich as if nothing about this is extraordinary? To him, the image was both alien and aggravating, a riddle without a solution. He slid his chair closer, his eyes fixed on her smallest movements. Occasionally, Amira would take a sip from an old plastic water bottle, then place it back within reach. She didn't use her phone, didn't put on headphones, didn't seek distraction. She simply stayed, alert, steadfast. A breeze drifted in through his study window, carrying the faint scent of lavender from the garden. Elias closed his eyes briefly, and for a moment he saw Miriam sitting across from him as she once had. Miriam, who had been capable of quiet, unshakable acts, sitting for hours by a friend's sickbed, defending her principles even when no one else stood with her. Goodness is a choice. Elias. She had told him one autumn evening, her voice low but firm. Even in the worst moments, people can choose to do what's right. He had dismissed her words back then, chalking them up to her idealism, her stubborn belief in virtues that didn't survive long in the real world. But now, in Amira's stillness, he saw Miriam's words come alive, and it unsettled him. He leaned back, but the comfort of his chair didn't come. For years, Elias had built himself a fortress of cynicism and bitterness. That wall had always made him feel safe. But today, in that empty hallway with a young woman quietly eating a stale sandwich, he felt the first cracks forming. He shook his head slightly, as if to banish Miriam's ghost from the present. But his eyes stayed locked on Amira, not to test her anymore, but to understand her. What was she thinking? What kept someone rooted there, guarding another man's fortune while her own life was unraveling? Elias had no answer. He only knew he couldn't look away. The door to his study creaked open softly, but the sound jolted him like a gunshot. Margaret Shaw entered, adjusting the pearl necklace at her throat. Her face was composed, but her voice carried the familiar edge of barbed civility. "Sir," she said, her eyes flicking to the monitor, brow creasing. "She's acting. That's all this is. You know the type." Elias didn't turn, but his hand tightened on the chair arm. The type. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Margaret didn't need to say outright. It dropped into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples through the thoughts he was trying to keep down. He slowly turned to her, his gaze colder than usual. Acting how? Margaret shrugged, feigning innocence, though the slight curl of her lips betrayed her disdain. "Think about it. She knows you're watching. Playing the honest card is the smartest way to stay employed or get your sympathy. People like that, they know how to play the part." Elias stayed silent. Her words tapped into the part of him that had lived too long in betrayal, making them sound plausible. He'd seen all kinds of fakery people begging for trust, performing victimhood to win favor. Was Amira any different? But when he looked back at the monitor, there she was, still sitting straight on the wooden chair, eyes fixed on that half-open door, not moving, not fidgeting. And somehow, that quiet presence made it impossible for him to fully believe Margaret. A sudden anger welled up not just at Margaret, but at himself. Angry that she'd dared reduce that stillness to a con, and angry that he couldn't immediately dismiss the idea because some stubborn part of him still wanted to cling to his old belief that everyone had a price, that everyone revealed their ugliness under pressure. He inhaled sharply, forcing himself back into control. "That's enough, Margaret," he said, his voice low and final. She opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes made her step back. She left quietly, closing the door behind her, returning the room to its heavy silence. Elias leaned back, his gaze fixed on the monitor. He felt suspended between two worlds, Margaret and the hard-earned lessons of a lifetime telling him to trust no one, and the image of Amira, a young woman guarding his fortune while her own life fractured. He shut his eyes briefly. Was he wrong, or was this just another mask he hadn't learned to peel away? For the first time in years, Elias didn't have an immediate answer. The sound of footsteps echoed down the long hallway, pulling Amira's gaze upward. It wasn't the same as the faint whistle of the wind through the window frames or the familiar creak of aging wood. This sound was heavier, steady, intentional. Elias Monroe appeared at the far end of the hall, walking slowly, as though his presence here was mere coincidence. His gray suit was slightly wrinkled at the elbows, his silver hair neatly combed, his sharp eyes concealing something more elusive beneath. He stopped in front of the door, still ajar, pausing as if weighing every word before speaking. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough and low, but not harsh. Amira rose immediately. She smoothed the creases from her jeans and stood with her back straight, a reflex more than a conscious choice. Her gaze didn't falter, but it didn't challenge either. It was simply calm, as though she had been preparing for this question her whole life. "Keeping watch for you," she said simply. Her voice carried in the hallway, firm but soft, without the slightest tremor. Elias arched a brow. Keeping watch over what? Amira gestured toward the open door. "What's inside?" "I think you forgot to lock it. This money doesn't belong to me." The words rang out plainly, yet they carried an inexplicable weight. Elias remained still, studying her like a scholar puzzling over a complicated manuscript. He had expected flustered stammering, maybe even a flicker of guilt or fear. But there was none of that. No excuses, no defensiveness, just a simple declaration, as if sitting there for hours had been nothing extraordinary, merely the obvious thing to do. He glanced toward the room. Everything was exactly as he'd left it, the stacks of cash neatly bound, the glittering tray of jewelry, the intentionally disordered papers. Nothing had been touched. Elias turned back to her, searching her face for the telltale signs of pretense. He'd seen plenty of people who knew how to wear masks, humble, harmless, trustworthy. But her eyes held only composure, neither submissive nor self-righteous. He drew in a slow breath, suddenly aware that he'd stepped into a game of wits where his opponent didn't even seem to know there was a game at all. "You think you did the right thing." Amira nodded without hesitation. "Yes, I just did what needed to be done. You were going to come back, and everything should still be here." Her words reverberated off the cold walls, leaving an echo that made Elias strangely uneasy, yet unwilling to look away. For a moment, he wasn't sure who was testing whom anymore. He fell silent, as though weighing something heavier than this simple exchange. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope, its corners folded with careful precision. Holding it between two fingers, he extended it toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. "Take it," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Payment for your honesty." Amira glanced at the envelope, her expression flickering with surprise. She didn't ask what was inside, but its weight and his deliberate way of handing it over told her enough. It was a substantial sum, likely more than she'd ever seen in her life. Elias didn't look away. He'd seen that look before, that blend of shock and hunger when money was suddenly within reach. Most people gave in quickly, even those who swore they couldn't be bought. Give them a number big enough, and every declaration of principle turned to ash. "Think of it as a reward," he added, "for not stepping inside. That's all." Amira didn't move to take it. She stood there, looking at the envelope as if it were some foreign object from another world. She didn't avert her gaze or play at false modesty. She simply let the silence stretch between them. "Not everyone gets an opportunity like this," Elias said, his voice carefully even, though something restless stirred inside him. He wanted her to take it. He wanted her to confirm what he believed, that everyone had a price. $50,000, enough to pay your debts, take care of your mother, continue your studies without breaking your back at odd jobs, easy money, no strings attached. Amira drew in a deep breath, as if weighing his words. Then she raised her eyes to his. Her gaze was so steady it unsettled him. "I can't take it," she said slowly. His brow furrowed. "Why not?" "Because it doesn't belong to me," Amira replied, nearly repeating herself. "Same as that room. I didn't do anything to deserve that money." Elias felt a low, smoldering irritation spread through his chest. He wasn't used to being refused, especially when offering what he considered generosity. But there was something in the way she spoke calm, neither pleading nor self-righteous, that made it impossible to get angry. He lowered the envelope but didn't put it away. "You really don't want it. Chances like this don't come twice." Amira only shook her head. "If I take it, I become someone I don't want to be." Her words cut like a blade, silencing him. He stared at the envelope in his hand, for the first time wondering if he understood anything about the woman standing before him. Amira's eyes stayed fixed on the envelope, but they didn't waver. She drew a long breath, as if gathering herself for what came next, then lifted her gaze squarely to his. "I can't take what isn't mine," she said, slow and clear, "even if you call it a reward." Her answer landed heavy, freezing the hallway in its wake. Elias stood there, envelope in hand. His shoulders stiffened as though he'd just heard a language he'd forgotten how to interpret. For years, he'd grown accustomed to watching people compromise their principles for numbers on a check. They'd say they had values, but when the right amount was placed in front of them, those values crumbled. That was why he'd trusted this test. He hadn't handed her that envelope merely as payment. He'd wanted proof that he was right, that everyone could be bought, that goodness was just a mask people wore until it was inconvenient. But this woman didn't follow his script. Elias studied Amira, trying to decipher some hidden motive behind her serene expression. He waited for hesitation, for a darting glance at the envelope, for any sign that she was fighting temptation. But all he saw was resolve. No anger, no mockery. Just a young woman who had refused, plainly and irrevocably. What he knew could change her life. "You know how much this is?" Elias asked, his voice raspy, as if searching for some way to make her reconsider. Amira nodded. "I know. And you don't need it." "I do," she said without flinching. "But needing it doesn't make it right. If I take it, I owe you something I can never repay, and I don't want to start my life with debts like that." Elias said nothing. Her words hit a place inside him he hadn't thought anyone could reach. For a moment, he felt small in front of someone he thought he should be controlling. He slowly lowered the envelope, his gaze lingering on her thin fingers clasped neatly in front of her. It felt as if he just lost a game he hadn't even realized he was playing. For the first time in years, Elias had no words, no judgments, no cutting remarks or cold certainties. He realized then this test had never really been about her. It had been about him. He turned slightly, as if to hide the flicker of vulnerability on his face. The walls he had spent decades building now bore their first cracks, and through them, he saw a simple truth. There are some people money cannot reach. Elias drew a slow breath and muttered, almost to himself, "Maybe I was wrong." And in that moment, he knew the game he had set in motion had become a lesson he'd have to learn himself. The hallway fell into stillness. The ticking of the wall clock sounded distant, like it was coming from another lifetime. Light streamed through the tall windows, catching particles of dust that swirled lazily, trapped in an invisible current. Amira stood unmoving, hands still clasped together, while Elias stared into the empty space ahead, as though searching for something buried in the dust of memory. 3 years ago, Elias began, his voice raspier, lower than usual, "I paid for a boy's heart surgery." The words tumbled out unexpectedly, like a loose stone breaking free from the carefully sealed wall he'd built around himself. Amira's head lifted, her eyes widening. She didn't know how to respond. Elias kept speaking, his gaze fixed on some distant point rather than her. He was 8 years old. The hospital said his family had no insurance, no way to afford what could save him. I wrote a check. No one knew. I didn't want them to. Some things you do don't need thanks. He stopped, as if startled by his own confession. Elias Monroe was not a man who shared. He kept everything locked inside the losses, the rare acts of kindness he couldn't quite explain. But now, standing before this girl, the silence felt impossible to maintain. Amira said nothing at first. Her mind clung to his words, a boy, 8 years old, heart surgery. Her chest tightened. She saw Paco, her cousin, clear as day, as if he were standing right there in her mother's living room, thin, skin pale, eyes hungry for life but too tired to keep fighting. "That surgery," Amira's voice broke through, hesitant. "Was it at Grady Memorial?" Elias turned to her, surprise flickering in his eyes. He nodded once. Amira took a sharp breath, her fingers curling into fists so tight the knuckles whitened. Heat rose in her chest, not anger, but a sudden, overwhelming rush of emotion she couldn't suppress. "That boy was my cousin," she said, each word dropping heavy from her lips. Silence swept over the hallway. Elias stared at her, as if seeing Amira for the first time, not a housekeeper in his home, not a subject of his little test, but a person carrying a story all her own. "Paco," she added, her voice cracking. "We had nothing. The doctors said there'd be no miracle without money. Then the hospital called and said an anonymous donor had paid for everything." Elias didn't answer. He only tilted his head slightly, his eyes darkening, as if the name had always been carved somewhere inside him, waiting for this moment to surface. For a long moment, they simply stood there, no longer employer and employee, not tester and tested, just two human beings, connected by a memory that had once saved a life. Elias slowly turned his face away, his gaze drifting toward the shadows of the room behind him, as though revisiting a memory he'd long locked away. His voice came slow, each word carved carefully before it left his mouth. "Yes, that boy, your cousin. I know his name. Paco." The sound of it was plain, but it landed heavy, a confirmation, sealing shut 3 years of unanswered questions that had lingered in Amira's mind. She broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks unchecked, and she didn't bother to wipe them away. I wondered so many times," Amira whispered, her voice trembling. "Who would do that? The hospital said he wanted to stay anonymous. I prayed I'd meet him one day, just to say thank you. And now, it's you." Elias remained still, hands loose at his sides. He didn't step closer, didn't retreat. Something unreadable flickered in his eyes, a mixture of relief and a deep, unsteady discomfort. He had done good things before, but always kept them secret. He never believed kindness could be given without being turned into a debt. But now, in front of this girl, the secrecy felt meaningless. Amira drew in a shaky breath, forcing herself to speak through the tears. Her gaze met his grateful, but fierce. "I took this job, just to meet you," she said, her voice quivering but steady. "To meet the man who saved my family." Elias raised his brows slightly, like he didn't quite believe her. "You took this job just to meet me." Amira nodded. "I told the agency I wanted work in this area. I didn't care what it was. I just wanted a chance to meet the man who paid for that surgery. I didn't even know what I'd say if I saw you, but I knew I had to try." He said nothing, letting her words sink in his mind. He heard Miriam's laughter, his late wife's voice, reminding him of something she used to say, that kindness didn't need rewards. but sometimes the real reward was seeing its meaning. He'd never believed her. Not until now. Amira wiped her tears with the back of her hand, though they kept falling. I didn't come here for money, or for this house. I just needed to say, thank you. Elias felt a weight in his chest he couldn't shake. The test he'd crafted to expose her had become a mirror, reflecting himself and the truths he'd long abandoned. He stood silently, the envelope still in his hand, as if it could somehow anchor him. But he knew the thing shaking wasn't in his grip. It was the walls he'd built around himself for decades. He never thought a simple experiment would lead here to this moment, where he wasn't the one evaluating, but the one being seen. Not by the prying eyes of the world, but by a young woman he'd assumed was no different from anyone else. Inside his head, a storm raged. He saw again the faces that had hardened him, the friend who'd betrayed him for personal gain, the son who'd treated him as nothing but an obstacle to power, the employees who'd feigned loyalty only to steal what they could. All of it had taught him that people were only good until tested. But Amira had sat there for hours, guarding a room full of money that could have changed her life, without crossing the threshold. And now she stood before him, eyes red but unshaken, saying she did it all just to say thank you. Elias knew there was no way to twist this into manipulation. He turned away, unwilling to let her see his face, because he realized her gaze revealed more of him than his had of her. The test he'd designed to expose her had become a mirror, showing him for what he was, an old man living in a fortress built of suspicion and bitterness. Maybe. Elias spoke, his voice hoarse, as though unused to saying the words. Maybe I was wrong. Amira didn't answer. She just stood there, waiting. This test. Elias exhaled. I thought it would prove no one is as good as they claim. But instead, it showed me I've been too busy proving myself right to see that some people live for more than money. The space between them fell quiet again. Amira bowed her head slightly, not in fear or submission, but in respect for a man brave enough to admit he'd been wrong. Elias felt a strange sense of relief, like he'd finally set down a burden he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For the first time, he no longer saw her as someone to be tested. She wasn't an employee to scrutinize. She was living proof of something Miriam had always believed: goodness is a choice, even in the harshest circumstances. He took a deep breath and turned back toward Amira. Thank you, Elias said, the words landing heavy and honest, foreign on his tongue but true. In that moment, he knew the game was over, and the one who'd learned a lesson wasn't Amira. It was him. The next morning, sunlight streamed in at a slant through the wide windows of the Monroe estate's study, glazing the old wooden shelves and the somber portraits on the walls in warm, golden light. Miriam's face gazed down from one of those portraits frozen in oil paint, forever dignified, forever unflinching. Elias often avoided looking at it. Today, he didn't. Amira stood near the door, hands clasped in front of her, as though by holding herself still she could quiet the storm inside. The room was so silent she could hear the ticking of the wall clock and the soft creak of Elias's footsteps across the hardwood. He was at his desk, retrieving a worn leather briefcase. From it, he drew out a thick folder of documents clipped neatly with a gold fastener. He didn't speak at first. He simply placed them on the desk, then turned to look at her. You've heard of the Monroe Foundation. Elias's voice was even like he'd rehearsed this in his head. Amira nodded. She'd seen the name in passing, a charitable foundation mentioned in small print articles and community bulletins, but she didn't understand why he was bringing it up now. Elias settled into his chair. His hands, lined, knotted with age, rested on the folder. I started it after Miriam died. His voice caught slightly at the name, though he forced it smooth. She believed money meant nothing if it only sat in a vault. didn't share that faith. But I kept my promise to her. His gaze drifted toward the portrait above the mantel. For a moment, the room felt like Miriam's presence had stepped closer, as if she were listening too. But for years, he went on, it's been nothing but paper, an institution on letterhead, no heart, no one leading it where it needs to go. Amira said nothing. She waited, sensing that whatever was coming wasn't casual. Elias leaned forward, sliding the folder across the polished surface toward her. I want you to run it, he said, voice low but steady. The words hit her like a shockwave. Me. Yes. Amira stared down at the folder, then back up at him, expecting some hint of jest, but Elias wasn't smiling. His face was grave. Sir, I'm just a grad student, she said carefully. I've never run a foundation. I don't even know the first step. Elias folded his arms, leaning back into the chair. Skills can be learned. Integrity and courage. You either have them or you don't. And I've tested you. His eyes softened, just slightly. You've shown me what I needed to see. He paused, as though weighing each word before setting it free. Legacy isn't money. It's who you trust to carry it forward. The sentence landed heavy, like he was passing her something more than responsibility, like he was placing Miriam's torch in her hands. Amira couldn't respond. The fear and weight of it swirled in her chest. Elias rose, placing one hand on the folder in front of her. You guarded my money without being asked. Now I want you to guard something bigger, my legacy. Before she could answer, the door burst open without a knock. A tall man in a slate-gray tailored suit strode in, his polished shoes striking the floor with deliberate rhythm. His presence shifted the air instantly, like a predator entering a clearing. Amira recognized him from the black and white photographs in the hallway, Victor Monroe, Elias's son. He didn't spare Amira a glance. His eyes locked on his father, sharp and unblinking. What is this? His voice was clipped, every syllable honed like a blade. Elias didn't flinch. He straightened the papers on the desk. Introducing Amira Johnson. She'll be running the Monroe Foundation. Victor froze for half a breath, then let out a laugh, dry, cutting, without a trace of humor. You can't be serious. You're handing over our family's foundation to the help. The word landed like a slap. Amira felt it, though she kept her posture unbroken. Eyes lowered, hiding the blaze that rose inside. Yes, Elias said simply. She'll take over the foundation. Father. Victor's tone dropped, quieter but more dangerous. We're talking about the Monroe Foundation, the work of generations, and you're giving it to an employee with no pedigree, no credentials. Do you know what people will say? This legacy isn't for people obsessed with appearances, Elias replied coolly. Victor stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor until it nearly swallowed Amira. Have you lost your mind? You spent your life building the Monroe name, and now you're handing it to this. He finally turned his gaze on Amira, a slow, scathing appraisal from head to toe, his disdain undisguised. You really believe she understands value, that she knows what this name means? The venom in his voice wasn't just about status. It was coded, dripping with the same poison Amira had heard her whole life, people like you. Amira's fists clenched at her sides, though she stayed silent. She knew how to survive these rooms, the ones that treated her as less, but under her skin, something fierce was waking. Elias rose to his full height, squaring himself against his son. If you're here to insult her, leave. She has something you've never had. Victor integrity, courage. Victor smirked, his lips curving in a humorless arc. Integrity doesn't run a foundation. Father, money does. Power does. And I won't let an outsider destroy what belongs to us. The last word us echoed, staking a claim Amira felt like a wall closing in. For a beat, no one moved. The only sound was the ticking of the clock. Steady. Merciless. Victor adjusted his cufflinks with a controlled flick, as though taming his own rage. If you want to ruin your legacy by giving it to her, fine. But don't expect me to stand by and watch. It wasn't a threat. It was a declaration of war. And Victor kept his word. The weeks that followed were a quiet siege. Suddenly, the steady inflow of donations to the Monroe Foundation froze, trapped in a web of legal reviews and compliance holds orchestrated by attorneys whose names Amira learned quickly. Meetings with longtime partners evaporated, replaced by polite declines and apologetic phone calls. Employees who once greeted her with cautious smiles now avoided her gaze, whispering in the hallways as though she were a ghost passing through. Then came the articles. Not in the big papers, not yet, but in the places that travel fast. They questioned the competence of an unqualified hire to manage a legacy foundation. Some went further, insinuating she was Elias's token pawn, a distraction from murky finances. She read every word, each one a blade carving away at a reputation she hadn't even had time to build. At her mother's kitchen table one evening, she saw the paper laid out. Her mother's eyes were red, her lips pressed tight. She didn't speak. That silence cut deeper than any headline. Amira didn't need evidence to know Victor's hand was in all of it. His fingerprints were everywhere, the high-powered attorneys, the journalists who just happened to have insider information, the subtle, coordinated alienation of staff. One longtime employee, a man who'd been with the foundation since its inception, spoke softly after a meeting. They want you to quit, to realize you don't belong here. Amira returned to her small office, sat among the piles of files Elias had entrusted her with, and stared at the chaos Victor had sown. Fear lingered at the edges, cold and whispering, but beneath it, something hotter grew, a quiet, burning defiance. Elias saw it too. One late afternoon, as the sun bled gold across the study, he said he won't stop. Victor wants this path cleared for him, and he'll take it back by any means. Amira met his eyes, then turned to the window. The light caught floating specks of dust, turning them into tiny constellations. And in that moment, she understood this wasn't just a job anymore. Victor had turned it into a battleground. But if this was war, Amira wasn't going to fight it alone. And for the first time, she felt Miriam not just in the portrait, not just in Elias's words, but in the quiet courage settling into her bones. The days that followed passed like a string of sleepless nights for Amira. She sat alone in her small office, watching the fluorescent light glint off towering stacks of paperwork. The ticking of the clock felt like a countdown to a trial where she was the accused, and somewhere out there, the verdict was already being written. The press didn't stop. Articles appeared one after another from local tabloids to financial journals, all asking the same question. Who is running the Monroe Foundation? They called her a nobody, a hand-picked opportunist, and, in one anonymous hit piece, accused her of using the foundation as her personal wallet. Amira read each line, feeling every word drive deeper like a blade into the reputation she hadn't even had time to build. Even inside the foundation, the air had shifted. Employees who once greeted her with cautious smiles now avoided her gaze in the hallways, muttering to each other in hushed tones she couldn't make out. Amira knew Victor had bought off a few of them, planting invisible traps a file accidentally altered, an expense deliberately misreported, small errors, but enough to erode her credibility. Then came the hardest blow. The money stopped. Donors who had once been consistent suddenly postponed their contributions, citing restructuring. Some contracts were canceled with airtight legal excuses. The weekly financial report showed the foundation was on the brink of freezing operations. Amira understood if this continued, the Monroe Foundation would become a rudderless ship. She had never felt so small. Each morning, she braced herself to face a world that seemed determined to push her out. At night, her mother would call, trying to mask her worry but failing to hide the fear in her voice. "Amira, are you sure you're okay? People, they're saying so much about you." But Amira didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She knew one thing: the more she reacted, the more ammunition they'd have to tear her down. So, she chose silence. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone observing, listening, and waiting for the right moment to strike back. Each day, she arrived earlier than anyone else, combing through every expense, cross-checking every report. She met with employees one by one, not to reprimand them, but to look them in the eye and see who still stood with her. Out there, Victor thought he had her cornered, but Amira knew the biggest battles aren't always won by shouting. Some wars are won with silence, the sharpest weapon of all. She clenched her fists, staring out the window where the morning sunlight crept through the blinds. "I won't give up," she whispered, and for the first time, those words weren't just a promise to herself. They were a declaration of war. Elias Monroe was no longer sitting idle. News of the frozen funds, the smear campaigns, and the whispers about Amira reached him faster than any official report. One morning, he appeared at the foundation's office, his cane tapping against the wooden floor, his old but sharp eyes burning as brightly as ever. "We won't let him push you out," he said, his raspy voice steady. Amira looked at him and saw in his gaze not only anger toward Victor but a strange, unshakable trust in her. Elias began moving the way only someone who'd once lived at the top of the power ladder could. He called in old friends, lawyers, businessmen, people who owed him favors. He attended dinners he had avoided for years, only to whisper a few well-chosen words that could turn entire negotiations. Some donors returned not because they believed in Amira, but because Elias demanded it. He didn't like wielding his influence, but this time, he used it like a shield. As for Amira, she didn't fight back with loud press conferences or indignant statements. She chose a different path, full transparency. She and her most loyal team members audited every single expense, posting transparent financial reports on the Foundation's website. She hosted public forums, answering questions openly. She didn't hide behind Elias's name, and when reporters came knocking, she didn't dodge them, but instead of defending herself, she spoke about the Foundation's work, the scholarships, the families saved from eviction, the small but meaningful community projects. "People can smear my name," she said at a small press briefing, "but I'll let the work speak for itself." That was Amira's way of fighting not with sharp words, but with something stronger, the truth. From a distance, Elias watched her stand tall amid the press's relentless questions, her slender frame unshaken, like a young tree holding firm in a storm. He thought of Miriam, of their late-night conversations about quiet power, the kind of strength that didn't need to be loud, but could still change the way an entire room saw you. Victor must have thought his schemes would break her, but instead, Amira turned them into her foundation. The smear pieces began to unravel when the public saw her transparency reports proving every accusation baseless. Some of the employees who had once defected quietly returned, persuaded not by fear but by her refusal to retaliate while steadfastly keeping the Foundation's work alive. This war had no explosions, only deliberate, steady steps. And in that silence, Amira and Elias were reclaiming what Victor had tried to destroy. Victor Monroe was not a man used to losing. When his articles failed to land, when his bought-off employees slinked back to Amira, when the funding began to recover, Victor knew he needed a new tactic, a decisive one. He hired a private investigation firm, the kind that dug up skeletons and made them dance. "Dig up everything," Victor ordered, his voice like steel. "Anything that can bring her down, I want it." A week later, a thick, detailed report landed on his desk, but as he flipped through it, Victor's fury morphed into something else: confusion. What had they found? A string of stories that couldn't tarnish her at all. Amira had once refused a bribe to prioritize a wealthy businessman's child for a scholarship. She'd returned expensive gifts from a major donor, fearing conflicts of interest. Once, she even used her own money to keep a community program afloat when the foundation's funding was delayed. The report Victor had hoped would destroy her instead painted a portrait of a principled woman willing to sacrifice personal gain to protect her values. Victor slammed the file shut and cursed under his breath. Damn it. Elias heard about it before Victor could spin his failure into something else. One late afternoon, father and son met in the grand study of the Monroe estate. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, casting their shadows along across the wooden floor. "You've gone too far, Victor," Elias said, his tone leaving no room for debate. Victor folded his arms, standing across from his father, unflinching. "I'm protecting this family. The Monroe name is our legacy, and you're letting an outsider destroy it." Elias braced himself against the desk, his old eyes still burning with fire. "You still don't understand. Our legacy isn't the name. It's what people remember about us. And she's doing something neither you nor I ever did, restoring the real purpose of the foundation your mother dreamed of." Victor scoffed. "You're naive. Idealism doesn't hold power. Money and control do." Elias stepped closer, his voice slow but unyielding. "If that power exists only to feed our egos and hurt people like her, then it isn't worth keeping. I'd rather hand it to someone with principles than watch it rot in the hands of someone consumed by greed." The air grew thick. Victor turned away, fists clenched, but said nothing. Elias watched him go, knowing he had just lost part of his son. But he did not waver. He had made his choice. Not blood, legacy. The kind Miriam had believed in, and now Amira carried forward. Victor Monroe disappeared from the picture quietly. No more smear articles, no more two-faced employees bought out behind closed doors, no more explosive arguments in the office. One morning, Elias received a short letter from his son, a few cold lines stating that Victor would withdraw from all activities related to the foundation. "So you can freely do what you believe is right. No apologies, no promises to meet again. Just the retreat of a man who knew he'd lost but wasn't ready to admit it to his father's face." Amira read the letter in silence, then placed it back on Elias's desk. "You all right?" she asked softly. Elias didn't answer immediately. He just stared out the window, where the morning light filtered through the trees, and said, "It'll take time. But sometimes, to preserve what has value, you must accept losing something else." A week later, in the Foundation's small assembly hall, Amira was officially appointed as executive director of the Monroe Foundation, but the name no longer remained the same. At her proposal, with Elias's full agreement, it was changed to Hope Network. The inauguration ceremony was modest. No pomp, no spotlight, just partners, a few journalists, and the families whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's work. Amira stepped up to the podium. Dressed in a simple navy dress that hugged her small yet steady frame, she held the microphone with both hands, drew in a deep breath, and began. 3 years ago, Amira said, her voice steady but full of emotion, my family had lost all hope. We were about to lose one of our most precious children. But then a miracle came, no name attached. No lights or applause, just an act of quiet kindness. Today, I stand here to tell you that miracles like that can be multiplied, and Hope Network will be the place where those miracles become real for hundreds, even thousands of families. Applause broke out, long, heartfelt, resounding. At the back of the hall, Elias tapped a trembling rhythm against his cane, watching the young woman he once tested now stand with a confidence as if she had always belonged there. Hope Network expanded quickly. New streams of funding poured in. New projects began scholarships for students in underserved communities, emergency relief for families on the brink of losing their homes, and grassroots health programs for neighborhoods long neglected. Within 6 months, hundreds of families had been helped. Elias often came to the foundation early in the mornings, sitting quietly in the glass-walled conference room, watching Amira lead discussions with her team. He rarely intervened. He only observed. And in his gaze was something that had long eluded him, a sense of peace he thought he'd never feel again. 3 months after Hope Network's rebirth, Amira stood on the stage of a national community development conference. The hall glowed under bright lights, cameras trained on her. Yet she didn't falter. The crisp white suit she wore gave her an aura of quiet authority, a striking image for someone who once sat silently outside the open door of Elias Monroe's vault. She held the microphone with both hands, bowed her head slightly, and began. 3 years ago. I couldn't have imagined being here. I was just a student working part-time, desperately trying to save my mother's small grocery store from bankruptcy. I had no power, no opportunity. But one person believed in me more than I believed in myself. And that's why I am here today. The hall grew still, every eye fixed on her. Amira took another breath. Elias Monroe believed in me when I was no one. He didn't just give me the chance to lead a foundation. He entrusted me with a legacy not to keep, but to share. And that's what Hope Network is, a place where everyone, no matter their starting point, can find a door that leads to hope. The applause that followed was not polite. It was recognition. Some delegates stood, others nodded as if they saw themselves in her story. In the front row, Elias didn't take his eyes off her. In her, he saw Miriam again, the firebrand who once gave speeches about justice and fairness, but now in a new form, younger, stronger, with her own story carved into her words. When the conference ended, Amira found Elias in a quiet corner of the grand lobby. He leaned on his cane near a window, the afternoon light painting his silver hair in gold. "How did I do?" she asked, half nervous, half hopeful. Elias turned, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I used to think legacy was about buildings with my name on them or investments that outlived me. But today, watching you up there, I understood something true. Legacy is finding someone who can take it further than you ever could." He placed his frail hand on her shoulder, his eyes softening. "You've done what I couldn't, turned a charitable foundation into a living network that truly touches people. And that makes me proud." Amira clasped his hand gently. "I'm only continuing what you and Mrs. Miriam started." Elias shook his head. "No, you're writing the next chapter in your own way, and that's what will keep it alive long after we're gone." In that moment, they both understood Hope Network was no longer just a foundation. It was a torch, and Amira was the one holding it, lighting the path for people who had never believed they deserved hope. That evening, a light breeze swept across the Monroe estate gardens, carrying the scent of lavender and freshly cut grass. On the old brick porch, 2 rocking chairs faced the wide-open fields. Elias sat in one, his cane propped against the armrest, his tired eyes watching the horizon, painted in amber by the setting sun. Amira walked out, still in her work clothes but barefoot, her steps quiet against the cool stone floor. She sat in the chair beside him. For a few moments, they simply listened to the creak of the chairs and the distant calls of birds returning home. Long day, Elias said, his voice rough but lighter somehow. Every day feels long, Amira replied with a soft smile. But at least, today was a good one. Elias turned his head toward her. The dying sunlight bathed her face, making her look both impossibly young and as though she'd always belonged to this place. You know, Elias began. There was a time I thought legacy meant the Monroe name on buildings, or investments that outlasted me. I clung to those things, thinking they'd make me immortal. He paused, inhaling deeply, as if ensuring his words would not break. But now, I understand. Legacy isn't what you leave behind, it's who you trust to carry it. Amira stayed silent, her eyes blurring. She understood this wasn't just about the foundation. It was about Miriam, about all the years Elias had locked himself away in his grief, and about this moment when he let go of his legacy, not because he stopped loving it, but because he finally trusted someone to carry it forward with the dignity it deserved. She placed her hand over his, squeezing gently. Then, Amira said, her voice firm but warm, "Let's carry it together." Elias looked at her, his eyes wet but glowing with a rare light. He nodded slowly, a faint smile breaking across his face. Together. They sat there in silence, watching the last light of day spread across the garden, gilding every old brick, every branch, and the two souls at opposite ends of life who now shared a single torch. In that moment, the Monroe Foundation, Miriam's memory, the years of solitude, the battles fought with Victor, all of it distilled into something simple, the passing of a torch. A torch handed from the one who had guarded it for a lifetime to the one brave enough to carry it forward. The last rays of sunlight touched the porch, sealing the moment like a benediction. And in that quiet warmth, they both knew the legacy had found its way. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.